The Last House on Gravedigger's Lane. The Benson family arrived in the town of Black Hollow just after dusk, their U-Haul rumbling up the narrow dirt road to their new home. The sky burned orange, the last light of day sinking behind the trees like a candle guttering out. The house loomed at the end of the lane, standing apart from the others, wrapped in a hush that didn't quite feel natural. "Looks bigger than I expected," Mark Benson said, rubbing the back of his neck. His wife, Claire, gave him a sidelong glance. "We got a great deal on it, remember?" "Yeah," Mark muttered. "Too great." Their son Danny pressed his face to the car window, eyes wide. "It looks haunted," Claire laughed. "It's just old, sweetie. Houses creak, that's all." But as she spoke, she felt a chill settle into her bones. The house did look haunted. Its windows, like dark, hollow eyes, watched them from behind sagging shutters. The wraparound porch dipped slightly to one side, as if tired of holding itself up. A thick hedge of dead ivy clung to the walls, like fingers digging into rotting flesh. The real estate agent had been almost too eager to sign the papers. "It's a bit of a fixer-upper," she'd admitted, "but it has character and history." They hadn't asked for details. Maybe they should have. The first night, the house whispered. Mark woke to the sound of footsteps above him, slow and deliberate. He held his breath, listening. Claire shifted beside him, but didn't wake. He checked the time. 2:47 a.m. He forced himself up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The wooden floor was cold beneath his feet as he made his way to the hallway. The attic door was closed. Hadn't he locked it? Another step, soft, right above him. His stomach tightened. "Mice," he told himself. "It's just mice." But when he turned to go back to bed, he caught something in the mirror on the hall wall. His reflection, standing there, watching. Except it was half a second too slow. When he turned his head, it followed, but not at the same time. There was a delay, subtle but unmistakable. Mark swallowed hard and stepped back into the bedroom, shutting the door. Strange things kept happening. Danny refused to go upstairs alone. He said he didn't like the way the shadows moved when no one else was around. "Shadows don't move on their own, honey," Claire told him. Danny stared at her, unblinking. "Here, they do?" And she saw it too, in small moments. The reflection in the bathroom mirror that lingered just a second too long. The bedroom door that never stayed shut no matter how many times she closed it. The whispering in the night, always just faint enough to make her question if she heard it at all. The attic door standing open in the morning. Mark insisted it was an old house settling, the wind, trick of the light. But then the neighbors started avoiding them. An old woman at the grocery store clutched Claire's wrist, her fingers like brittle twigs. "Get out before it takes you." Claire wrenched free, heart pounding. "Before what takes us?" But the woman only shook her head. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She sat up in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She thought of the attic, of the footsteps, of the feeling that they were never truly alone in the house. She wasn't wrong. The discovery came 2 weeks later. Danny had been playing in the upstairs hallway when he screamed. Mark and Claire ran to him, hearts in their throats. He was staring at the wall, eyes wide with terror. There, cast against the wallpaper, was a shadow. Not his. It was too tall, too thin, its fingers too long, and it moved even though Danny stood still. Claire grabbed him, backing away. Mark? Mark swallowed. It's just a trick of the light. The shadow cocked its head, as if listening, then it stepped forward. Danny screamed again, and the lights flickered. The shadow stretched, twisting across the floor toward them. They ran. They tried to leave the next day. Tried. The car wouldn't start. The phones had no signal. When they opened the front door, the yard stretched out endlessly. The road disappearing into a fog that hadn't been there before. The house had them now. At night, the footsteps returned, louder. The whispers became voices. The attic door swung open on its own, and the shadows grew. Mark stood before the hallway mirror, staring at himself. His reflection blinked slower than he did. Then it smiled. A cold, knowing smile. Behind him, Claire and Danny called his name, their voices distant, fading. Their shadows had already joined the others on the wall. Watching, waiting, trapped forever in the last house on Gravedigger's Lane, the puppet man. The first time they saw the puppet man, he was standing in the center of the town square, his wooden stage set up beneath the old elm tree. The banner above him, tattered at the edges, read, "The Marvelous Marionettes of Mr. Duval." No one had seen him arrive. The townspeople just woke up one morning, and there he was, as if he had always been there. His wagon was black, the paint peeling, its wheels deep in the dirt, as if it hadn't moved in years. The puppets, oh, the puppets were what drew people in. They moved so fluidly, their heads tilting, their hands gesturing with eerie precision. Their eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to follow the crowd, taking in everything. Too real, some murmured, too human. But the children loved them. Sarah Langley, a local reporter, watched from the back of the crowd, arms crossed over her chest. Something about the puppet man made her uneasy. He was tall, wiry, his face long and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that never quite blinked enough. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, practiced, wrapping around words like silk. The show was enchanting. That was undeniable. The marionettes danced and twirled, told jokes, sang songs. But something was off. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just puppets, that something inside them was alive. Then the children started disappearing. The first was Daniel Carter, age 6. His mother swore he had been right beside her at the show, laughing at the puppets. She blinked, and he was gone. The second was little Rosie Thompson, who had been raving about Mr. Duval's show all evening. By morning, her bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed. The town panicked. Police searched, volunteers scoured the streets. But no trace of the children was ever found. And yet, the puppet show continued. Sarah had seen enough. She waited until the crowds had left for the night, until the town square was empty except for Mr. Duval and his wagon. The stage was quiet, the puppets lined up neatly along the back wall, their lifeless bodies swaying slightly in the evening breeze. She stepped forward. "Mr. Duval," He turned slowly, his lips curling into a thin smile. Miss Langley, to what do I owe the pleasure? She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. I wanted to see the puppets up close. His dark eyes studied her for a long moment before he stepped aside, gesturing to the marionettes. Be my guest. Sarah hesitated before climbing onto the stage. Up close, the puppets were even more unsettling. Their hands weren't rough like wood. They were smooth, almost like skin. Their hair looked real too, fine and soft. And their eyes. She swallowed hard. Their eyes weren't glass. They were something else, something human. One of them, a small boy with neatly combed brown hair, twitched. Just the slightest movement, barely perceptible. Sarah's breath hitched. Daniel? She whispered, the puppet's lips parted. A soft, broken sound escaped. A whimper. She stumbled back, horror twisting in her gut. Mr. Duval sighed. You weren't supposed to see that. His hands moved too fast. The string caught her wrist before she could scream, before she could run. She felt the pull, the sudden sharpness in her limbs, the sensation of something hollowing her out from the inside. Her body refused to obey. Her fingers twitched. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. The puppet man smiled. And in the morning, the town awoke to find a new marionette on the stage. A lovely figure with soft brown curls, her glassy eyes wide, watching, waiting. The show must go on. The shadow box. Tommy Blake found the package on his front porch just after sunset. The air smelled of rain, thick and heavy, though the sky was clear. He hesitated, looking up and down the empty street before picking it up. The cardboard was old, softened at the edges, like it had been waiting for him a long time. There was no return address, no markings at all. Just a box, sealed tight with a single strip of yellow tape. He stepped inside, the screen door clapping shut behind him. His mom called from the kitchen, asking if he'd remembered to take out the trash. He mumbled something and carried the box to his room, setting it on his desk. It wasn't heavy, but there was something inside. Something that shifted slightly as he moved it. He grabbed his pocket knife and sliced the tape down the middle. The flaps popped open with a soft sigh of stale air. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled black paper, was an old wooden box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, made of dark, almost black wood. A tiny brass lock held the lid shut, its keyhole shaped like an eye. Tommy ran his fingers over the surface. It was warm, almost too warm. That night, the whispers began. At first he thought it was the wind, a draft slipping through his window, but then he heard his name. Soft, almost playful. Tommy. Tommy. He pulled the blankets up to his chin, heart pounding. The sound drifted from his desk, from inside the wooden box. His fingers twitched. He wanted to open it, needed to. Instead, he rolled over, squeezing his eyes shut. Sleep came slow and restless. The next day at school, he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on him. He barely touched his lunch. His best friend Charlie nudged him. Dude, you okay? You look like crap. Tommy just shrugged. Didn't sleep much. Charlie grinned. Too many scary movies? Tommy forced a laugh, but it died in his throat. He thought of the box, the way it had felt warm under his hands, the whispers. He shook his head. It was just his imagination. It had to be. That night he turned the box over in his hands. The lock daunted him. The keyhole seemed deeper than before, like a tunnel leading into darkness. The whispers started earlier this time, curling through the air as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Open it, Tommy." The voice was different now, familiar. A voice from long ago. "We remember you." His hands trembled. He wanted to throw the box away, to burn it, to get rid of it in any way he could. But before he could decide, he felt it. A weight under his bed. A shift in the darkness of his closet. A shadow stretching along the floor, growing longer, blacker. He had to open it. He had no choice. The lock popped open the moment he touched it. The lid creaked back, revealing nothing. No treasures, no objects, just a darkness deeper than any shadow. And then something moved inside. A shape, shifting, stretching, crawling into the light. It had a painted face, red smile, too wide, eyes black as a hole in the world. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. It was the clown from his nightmares, the one that used to stand at the foot of his bed when he was 5. The clown grinned. "You left us behind," it whispered, voice like dry leaves scraping together. "But we never left you." Tommy staggered back, but the shadows behind him thickened. The closet door creaked, the thing under his bed sighed, stretching its long, spindly fingers toward him. All his fears, all the monsters he had buried in the back of his mind were here. They had been waiting. The room twisted. The walls stretched, warped. He was not in his bedroom anymore. He was in the dark place, the place where fears lived. He ran, but the darkness had no end. Laughter echoed all around him, sharp and hungry. The clown's footsteps smacked against the floor, gaining on him. Something slithered along the walls. The closet door swung open, revealing a gaping maw of jagged teeth. Tommy screamed. His mother found him the next morning, curled up on the floor, shaking. His eyes were open but empty, staring at something she couldn't see. The box sat beside him, closed once more, the lock back in place. She took it, hands trembling, and carried it to the basement. She had seen it before, a lifetime ago. When she was a child, she too had opened it. And like her son, she had seen the things she had buried long ago. She placed the box on a shelf, deep in the dark, where it belonged. It would wait. It always waited. Because fear never truly dies. It only waits for someone to open the door again. The silent ones. Emma Morgan was the first to hear it. The sound of nothing. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, pressing in on her ears like cotton, making her heartbeat sound too loud in her chest. She turned to her friends, Ben and Lucy, as they stood at the edge of the dense forest, staring at the strange town that lay before them. "Where are we?" Ben whispered. Emma shook her head. None of them had ever seen this town before, though they'd lived in Willow Creek their whole lives. It wasn't on any map, and yet there it was, a collection of small houses, dirt roads, and people moving about their daily lives. But there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too careful, too precise, and most unsettling of all, Not a single one of them spoke. Lucy frowned. Why is everyone so quiet? Emma didn't answer. A cold shiver ran down her spine. They walked further into the town, their footsteps muffled against the dusty road. People paused mid-stride, glancing at them with wide, terrified eyes before quickly looking away. Doors creaked shut, curtains twitched. The whole town seemed to hold its breath as they passed. Then it happened. Ben chuckled. Just a small sound, barely more than a scoff. But it was enough. Every person in the street froze in place. As one, they turned to face the three intruders, their faces masks of pure horror. Some shook their heads violently. Others raised trembling fingers to their lips in a universal plea. Be quiet. A low rustling came from the trees beyond the town. A sound like something massive shifting through the leaves. Twigs snapped. The ground trembled. Something was coming. Emma grabbed Ben's arm, yanking him backward. Run, she mouthed, not daring to make a sound. The three of them bolted, their feet pounding against the dirt road. The townspeople remained frozen in place, staring after them, their silent warnings still etched on their faces. The rustling grew louder, faster, closer. They reached the edge of the town and plunged into the woods, the thick underbrush clawing at their clothes. Emma's lungs burned, her legs screamed for rest, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She could hear it now. The thing behind them, moving like a shadow through the trees, silent but impossibly fast. Lucy tripped over a root and hit the ground hard. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. A mistake. The forest went deathly still. Then a whisper, not a voice, not words, but something older, deeper, something that slid through the air like a snake through grass. And then Lucy was gone. One moment, she was scrambling to her feet, eyes wide with terror. The next, darkness swallowed her whole, dragging her into the trees without a sound. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just gone. Emma clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing. Ben stared at the spot where Lucy had been, his face pale, his body shaking. They had to keep moving. They ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest, away from the silent town and the thing that hunted within it. Finally, when their legs could no longer carry them, they collapsed against the base of a massive oak tree. Ben turned to Emma, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "What was that?" he whispered. She shook her head. She didn't know, and she didn't want to find out. Then, through the darkness, a new sound. Footsteps. Not from the creature, but from people. The townsfolk had followed them. Their faces, even in the dim light, were clear, solemn, sorrowful, and still utterly silent. One of them, an old man, slowly raised his hand. He pointed at Emma and Ben. Then he pointed at the ground. Stay. Emma understood now. The town had made a deal long ago. Silence in exchange for survival. But Emma and her friends had broken that silence. Lucy was already gone. And the thing in the forest wasn't done yet. It would never stop hunting. Not until the last sound was swallowed by the trees. The wrong number. Julia Reynolds was brushing her teeth when her phone rang. The sudden buzz made her jump. A smear of minty foam splattering onto her pajama sleeve. She frowned, spitting into the sink before grabbing the phone off the counter. Her own number was calling her. She blinked. The screen wasn't glitching. The number was real. It was hers. The same digits she'd had for years. A wrong number? Number that wasn't possible. Slowly she swiped to answer, pressing the phone to her ear. A whisper, faint, barely audible over the quiet hum of her bathroom's ventilation fan. Don't let him in. Her own voice. Then the line went dead. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The phone slipped slightly in her grip, slick with sweat. That had been her voice. Not just similar, hers. Same tone, same inflection. And she had sounded scared. Her pulse hammered as she stared at the darkened screen. A wrong number was one thing. A prank maybe. But this was something else entirely. Then came the knock at the door. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. She turned toward the sound, heart lurching against her ribs. Her apartment door was locked. She was sure of it. She hadn't buzzed anyone in. And yet, someone stood outside, waiting. Another knock. She crept toward the peephole, every instinct screaming at her to stop. But she had to look, had to know. Peering through, she saw him. A man in a dark coat, tall, too tall, his head almost brushing the top of the frame. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight like a normal person. He just stood there, still a stone. And then, he smiled. It was wrong, too wide. Lips stretching too far, as if his skin didn't quite fit. Julia's breath hitched. She stepped back, her mind racing. Don't let him in. Her own voice, her own warning. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the door. Another knock. Harder this time, more insistent. Her phone buzzed again. She yelped, nearly dropping it. The caller ID. Her number. Again, with a shaking thumb she answered. Don't speak, the whisper said. Don't move. He can hear. Her lungs froze. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Outside, the knocking stopped. A long silence stretched between her and the phone. She pressed it harder against her ear, desperate for more. Answers. Anything. Then, just before the line went dead again, she heard it. A breath. Not hers. Not from the phone. Behind her. She spun, eyes darting across the room. Nothing. The apartment was empty. It had to be. She was alone. Alone. Wasn't she? Her phone slipped from her fingers, landing face up on the floor. The black screen reflected her silhouette. And something else standing behind her. She didn't have time to scream.